Hello everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at optimizing the sim for use with an airliner. I just noticed my British tail number, so apologies for that. I appreciate that some of you would have been waiting for this video for quite a while, so just wanted to say thank you for waiting. Appreciate that. Now, let's look at the optimization. So we'll get straight into it. There's a couple of things to consider first, perhaps. First of all, we have to be reasonable when we're optimizing the sim. We have to understand that our hardware or what our hardware is capable of. So as an example, there's a YouTuber called Denny's Aviation who makes approach videos, really nice videos, showing an airliner approaching into various different airports around the world. And I've noticed that on several of those, there's a slight frame rate stutter. And the specs for this PC that Denny's Aviation is using are very high. So the CPU is what, AMD Ryzen 7, one of the X3D ones, I believe, and the GPU is the 32GB 5090. So if you bear in mind that even this machine that he's using, which is about as high a spec as you can get, is seeing these sort of quarter of a second frame rate hitches occasionally. I just think you have to bear in mind that you're not going to have a sim that is always 100% smooth, unless, let's say, you drop every graphic setting to 0, and then maybe you're going to have a really smooth experience, but it's not going to look that good. So the key really is optimization and getting that compromise between frame rate and visuals. Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking at today, and that's what we're going to be trying to do. So the first thing you want to do is go to the place in the world, in the airliner or the aircraft, that gives you the most trouble in terms of frame rates. So get in your complicated airliner and go to the place in the world that you go to, and that is very highly detailed and gives you frame rate issues. So I mean, don't bother optimizing the sim for somewhere that you're never going to go, because that would be pointless, right? So in my case, as you've seen from my previous videos, I fly in San Francisco quite a lot, so I've come to San Francisco Airport because it's quite detailed. There's a number of runways, the photogrammetry scenery all around. So it's quite a demanding airport, and it's one that I regularly use. And I'm optimizing for an airliner. I don't really fly airliners. I prefer the GA aircraft. But I'm doing the airliner because I know a lot of you guys do use airliners, and that's the most difficult aircraft to optimize the sim for. Something to bear in mind, there are some places that are really difficult to optimize. So like Los Angeles International, if I go there, there's a certain spot on that airport near the runway, near the control tower, and if I go there, my frame rates drop dramatically. So that would give me a real challenge to optimize for. So I found that I was able to get the frame rates to 60 in this particular spot, but then if I was to fly away from that spot, I would have frame rates of 120, but the visuals weren't that good. So you want to think about what's important to you. So for me personally, I would set it so that in that spot my frames were more like 50 frames per second, and that way I would have sort of better visuals. Do you know what I mean? I would accept a compromise in that my frames were dropping lower than I wanted them to, so that I could have better visuals when I wasn't in that one spot. Or you could just avoid that spot. So something to bear in mind. There are some areas of the sim that are not well optimized. I mean, that location, clearly you don't need to have that level of detail there. What they want to be doing ideally is seeing that there's an issue there and dropping the level of detail in that area so that various machines can handle it. But maybe, if you've got a decent CPU like I don't have, then maybe it's not an issue. Right, so that's that. That said, let's go into the settings. And what you want to do is, when it comes to optimization, first of all, turn off your max frame rate. VSync you can leave on, although I have it off, you may notice. That's just because I've got it on in NVIDIA control panel. Frame generation, turn off, and dynamic settings, turn off. And then come to your global rendering quality, and you're going to turn terrain level of detail and objects level of detail to their minimum. And then really just, I guess, turn everything down apart from some that you have that you would consider to be non-negotiable. So for me, that could be clouds, for example. Where are they? Volumetric clouds I've got set to high. I wouldn't go lower than that. So, that's my starting point for clouds. Texture resolution, high, that sort of thing. So obviously you have to be reasonable with that as well. If you've got an RTX 2070, you're not going to say, well, it's non-negotiable that I have everything on ultra. You've got to bear in mind your hardware and set these settings accordingly. So to reiterate, we're going to start off with everything on a low setting, other than those settings that for you are non-negotiable to have on higher settings. Okay. Then we're going to activate the developer mode. So I'm sure everyone knows where that is. We go into somewhere, advanced options, developer mode on, and then come to your debug, display FPS, tick, and you get this lovely little jumble of letters and numbers. So we're not going to go into this whole thing in detail, but I'll cover some of the more important things as we go. So let's look at, first of all, your physical memory. So you've got two numbers there. This is the number on the left that's being currently used, and to the right is the number that is available to the sim. So I've got 32 gigabytes total. Sim is using 6.5 gigabytes approximately, and I've still got a bunch available. So it's likely that 16 gigabytes is fine. I mean, that amount that is used will increase as we increase the settings, but yeah, 16 gigabytes is probably okay when you bear this in mind. I've got 32, but perhaps you can get away with 16, okay? Then we look at GPU memory. So I'm on 7 of 12, and as we saw, settings are low right now. So what I would say is that indicates perhaps that 8 gigabytes of VRAM's probably not enough. Something to bear in mind. So I'm sorry to say that if you've got 8 gigabytes of VRAM, it might be time to upgrade that. And what's important is that this number here never exceeds this number, and you're going to want some sort of buffer. So personally, I'm going to try and keep it around 10 gigabytes. Okay. So that's that. And then we're going to come out to graphics again. And we're going to start to set everything up ready for our sim. Well, let's have a look at what I've currently got. That's the first thing we'll do, isn't it? So here we are in the sim, and you can see that once everything settles down, my frame rates are around about 40, a little bit over 40 generally frames per second. So with frame generation activated, that's going to be about 80, which, in an airliner, perhaps that's more than we need, yeah? So we'll turn things up a bit. Now, one thing to bear in mind as well is that when you change a setting, it takes a little while for the sim to, load in the change of, for example, textures, or if you change the terrain LOD, it needs to load in all of that extra stuff or remove all of that stuff that was there previously. So you need to give the sim some time to settle down after you make a change. So don't make a change, see that your frames haven't changed, and assume that your change has had no effect. It may be that you just need to wait for the change to have effect. Okay, so we'll turn things up a bit. So we're going to come back out to here, and we're going to go to global rendering quality again, and we're going to say arbitrarily 100 object LOD and 100-ish terrain LOD. Okay. And then we have a look and see how that looks. So right now, 30-ish. Give it a few seconds to settle. Throw the sim around so it can adjust the terrain LOD. You can see it's loading in the new textures in the background there because we've changed the terrain LOD. There we go. So our frames now are, well, you can see they're dipping down to 32-ish. Okay. Now, let's come back into the sim, see if there's anything else that we want to adjust. Into the settings, rather. That's interesting. The texture's messed up. I had that before. If we reloaded the flight, that texture would be okay again, but we're not going to do that right now. It seems that when you're changing the settings, sometimes it can mess up the texture. Right, so anyway. So we've got these settings here. Is there anything else that I want to turn up? Probably not right now. Okay, so if you've turned everything in your sim down, you're probably going to want to turn these all up bit by bit, perhaps. Choose the ones that are most important to you, of course, and then go back out into the flight and have a look and see how it's looking in terms of your frame rate. Frame rate, if you're using frame generation, you want to keep that above 30 in order for it to not look sort of, the frame rate gets a bit horrible below 30, right? Also, when I should point out that when I'm recording, the frame rate can look a little choppy than it does in real life, just something to bear in mind. The recording doesn't seem to be as smooth as how it looks in real life, and I'm not sure what to do about that. But maybe I'll look into fixing that another time. So there we go. What we can say now is that I've turned everything up to more or less how I want it to be. You could spend more time on that, obviously, coming in and out and tweaking your settings until you get your frames to be where you want them to be. Okay, so it's a personal preference thing, isn't it? How high you want them. Like I said, you don't want to go below 30, I would say, but you can go as high as you want in terms of frames. Personally, for me, it looks best at 80 frames per second, but I'm not going to be unrealistic. When I'm flying an airliner with my personal CPU specifications, it's not realistic to expect a frame rate of 80 with the frame gen enabled. So I'm going to go for 60 instead, or thereabouts. So right now you can see 35-ish. So I could probably crank things up a little bit more. Maybe we'll do that quickly. I mean, you get the idea, right? I don't want to waste your time by tweaking my settings for hours on end. But you want to set it so that you're happy with your frame rates. And you want to give yourself a little bit of leeway as well to keep things smooth. So as I said, give it a second when you make a change. So we want to still make sure we're above 30. You can see we are we dropping, or is it just because it's loading up? Yeah, no, I think we're safe at 30-ish, 33. Right, so then we want to cap the frame rate. So the reason we need to cap it is to keep it smooth, because if your frames keep fluctuating, that's when you see stutters as well. I mean, you see major stutters if you exceed this number here. Maybe I should show you what that looks like as well. So let's say that's 400, for example. As I said before, first you won't notice that change, and then you'll gradually see the usage increase, and then you can see my frames are starting to decrease as well. Are we going to get above? I'm not sure if that's going to push it high enough. I mean, the frame rates are already quite low, aren't they? Yeah, it's steadily creeping up, and now you can see it's exceeded, or it's about to exceed the maximum. And then if I rotate now, you can see the frame rate is absolutely shocking. So for that reason, it's important to make sure that when you're tweaking your settings, you don't find that your GPU mem exceeds that, because when it does, you've got a massive stuttering problem. Okay. Right, let's come back out of that, turn that down before my PC explodes. Right, so back to 120 or 130, whatever. Let it settle down a bit. I mean, already you can see it's gone fairly smooth again. So when we were looking earlier on, we could see that the frames were, generally speaking, not dipping below 32, right? And as I was saying earlier, it's important that the frame rates don't go up and down all the time, because the frame rates going up and down will be perceived as stutter. So you need to lock it, and you need to lock it at the lowest that your frame rates go, more or less, because you don't want it to drop below that number. So that's something to consider. So let's come out. We're going to say that 32, right, is as low as it goes. So enable max frame rate, set that to 32. Then we want to use the dynamic settings, and we want to set that to just below what we've set this to. And the reason is that the way dynamic settings works is that it'll adjust some of the settings to prevent the frame rates from dropping below what you set. So it can really help with smoothness. So, well, in fact, it's done it already. So we've got 30 frames per second set there. So the dynamic settings is going to attempt to prevent the settings dropping below 30. And we have prevented the frames from exceeding 32. So the idea is that there's a very small range of frames that the sim's going to be working within, and therefore you're not going to see the frame rate hitching, changing. You're not going to see stutters, because the frame rate is going to remain more or less the same the whole time. All right. Then we're going to need frame generation. So we'll turn that on. There we go. So back into the sim. Now we should see a fairly smooth 60 plus frames per second. And that does look very smooth to me. Just keep an eye on that GPU mem number. It did go high for a second there. Okay. But it's okay. I think we're all right. Good. I have my frame rate higher than I normally would as well. Normally I have it at 2K. I'm using 4K at the moment because otherwise I can't read all of this stuff. So, yeah. So my sim is going to look smoother than this when I've adjusted that. Now, if we look at this number here, we can see that the terrain LOD is being altered, right? It was previously at 1. I should have mentioned that before, perhaps. But previously, terrain LOD factor, before we activated the dynamic, whatever it was called, what is that setting called? Oh. Yeah, dynamic settings, right? Yeah. So before we activated dynamic settings, this terrain LOD factor was at 1. And now it comes down because it's altering the terrain LOD factor, which is great when you're at an airport where you can't really see the terrain. You know, all you can see is generally buildings and stuff like this. So it doesn't really matter if the terrain LOD factor is reduced when you're here at the gate. The lowest it will bring it down to is a factor of half, so 0.50. And the next thing we want to do is take the aircraft for a flight to make sure that this number is above 1 when we're flying, or is at 1 when we're flying. Because if it keeps changing, then what you're going to see that as pop in, which is obviously bad. And if you've seen my other videos, you'll know that I'm highly allergic to pop in. So you're going to want to keep that number at 1 when you're in the air, ideally. Doesn't matter if it's 50 when you're on the ground. So we'll get this thing in the air and we'll check that out next. I'm just going to go for it. Sorry, I appreciate that some of you will find this quite upsetting that I'm literally just going to take off like this without using the runway. I do apologise, but I don't want to waste too much of your time. Probably time to leave the ground. I don't fly airliners generally, so you'll have to excuse me for flying like it is a sort of GA aircraft or a jet fighter or something. So now you can see terrain LOD factor is back at 1. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll come down over the city. And what we want to do is see that that remains at a factor of 1. So what we're really looking for is when you're at the place that is most complicated for your PC to handle, so normally at the gate of a complicated airport, the LOD factor is 50 or 0.50, because that means that it's reduced those settings to maintain a high frame rate when you're on the ground, but you want that to remain high when you are in the air, or you want it to remain at 1 when you're in the air, because if it keeps going up and down when you're in the air, it's going to be adjusting the terrain LOD here, and you'll see it popping in and out, which is not a good look. Sorry if this video is on the long side, but I feel like it's necessary to make it work. I was thinking of doing like a 2-parter, but in the end I just thought, I know you guys have been waiting for this, I'll just crack on with it and see what happens. I should probably get a script or something. But it's quite hard to read a script, isn't it, while you're messing with settings or flying an aircraft, so generally I just blag it. So yeah, we need to keep an eye on that train LOD. You see it's dropping a tiny bit as we approach the more complicated photogrammetry of the city here. So, you know, we're going to accept some tiny drops, but we don't want significant drops. How's our speed? Are we going to fall out of the sky? Maybe. Let's try and get up a bit. I hope this has been useful to you guys so far. If it has, then please do subscribe and like and comment and all that good stuff to support the channel. And in the future, we'll be looking at all the different aspects of the visuals and so on in the sim to get it looking really smooth. So we'll be looking at frame generation, the best way to implement that. We'll be looking at the NVIDIA settings. Sorry for you guys who have AMD GPUs, I don't, so I can't really help you with that. I mean, you can see that it is looking pretty smooth. I think we had a slight stutter a moment ago, but as I was saying earlier on, you know, I can see guys with 5090s who are seeing those kinds of stutters, so I think you have to be a bit reasonable. If you're going to have the settings looking super nice, you're not going to have a situation where you never ever see a slight frame rate hitch, I'm afraid to say. So checking out that train LOD factor again. I think we can be happy that that's quite well optimized, right? So now we've got the LOD is very rarely dropping below 1 in flight, even over a pretty complicated photogrammetry city like this one, San Francisco. And when we were at the gate, it was, you know, the train LOD was around 0.50, which is what we're looking for. You can see it's down a little bit right now. God, don't think we need to be going that fast, do we? Maybe someone can teach me how to fly one of these at some point. So train LOD factors settle down again. You can optimize it more, you know, you can spend time obviously setting it very carefully so that it never exceeds 1, but don't obsess about it. Just try to make sure that you're happy with what you're seeing with your eyeballs. And then the next important thing obviously is the approach into the airport. How does that look? Does that become very stuttery? So let's find out. I'm going to go back into San Francisco, just over there. Once again, I apologise for the horrible way that I'm going to fly this aircraft. Where is just the airport? There it is. So we need to get down below those clouds and then put it on a runway. I hope you agree that it is looking nice. If you spend a bit of time on those settings, you know, tweaking them and just trying to keep that frame rate to whatever you want it to be personally. It should be above 30 anyway for any GPU if possible, before you enable frame generation. But you know, if you have a better setup than me, if you have a better GPU, a better CPU, then you can potentially have this at 80 or whatever you like. We are way high, aren't we, for this airport? So just through the clouds there, we can just about make out the runway. And we have to keep an eye on our frame rate. We want it to remain as smooth as possible, although we are going to accept some kind of frame rate hitches and so on. We're not going to expect a completely smooth, perfect experience. Terrain LED right now is still 1, which is great. But it's potentially going to come down as we come in for a landing. This is just the worst landing anyone has ever carried out in one of these, isn't it? I mean, you know, it could have been worse, right? It wasn't a bumpy landing, I don't think. Under the circumstances, I think that landing was pretty smooth. Right, so we're going to head over to the airport terminal and just make sure we're happy with the frame rate still, and then we're going to call it a day. So the landing, I think, and the approach into the airport was pretty smooth actually, right? We didn't see any significant stutters there. So I think we can be happy that it's a pretty well optimized sim, and we could even push it a bit harder if we wanted to. We could potentially have the frame rate lower at the gate, bearing in mind that a high frame rate is perhaps not important when you're just sat there waiting for your passengers to board. So yeah, potentially we could push that higher so that we have better visuals when we're in the air, but bearing in mind that we want to try to prevent terrain LOD factor from dropping, you know, frequently or significantly while we're in the air. It's quite difficult to balance the two. So if you wanted to have the frame rates, or if you were willing to accept a lower frame rate at the gate and you wanted a higher visual quality in the air, you might even have to turn off the dynamic settings. So we return to where we started, and I hope you'll agree that was a pretty smooth and well optimized flight. So we'll call it a day there. As I say, please do subscribe and all that good stuff, and we'll continue looking at ways to optimize the sim and improve the smoothness in the future. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for watching.